What if thousands of people suddenly became living magnets? The year was 1842. In a modest textile factory outside Manchester, England, 16-year-old Mary Thornfield was threading needles when something impossible happened. The steel needle in her hand refused to let go, not because she was gripping it tightly, but because it was gripping her. The metal clung to her fingertips as if her skin had become a magnet, and when she tried to pull away, a dozen other needles from the nearby workstation flew through the air and stuck to her arms. Mary screamed. The other girls gathered around, their faces pale in the dim gaslight filtering through the factory's grimy windows. But as they watched in horror, something even stranger occurred. The brass buttons on Mary's dress began to rattle and vibrate, pulling toward her hands. The iron pins holding her hair in place loosened and drifted toward her shoulders like metal snowflakes drawn by an invisible force. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was patient zero of an epidemic that would sweep across Europe for the next 20 years, affecting tens of thousands of people in ways that medical science couldn't explain and governments preferred not to acknowledge. The phenomenon began appearing simultaneously across multiple countries in the early 1840s, not spreading gradually like a disease, but erupting in clusters, as if something in the environment had suddenly activated dormant properties within certain individuals. The pattern was as baffling as the condition itself. Young women between the ages of 14 and 25, concentrated in specific geographic regions, all developing the same impossible ability to attract metal objects with their bare skin. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German physician working in Bavaria during the height of the epidemic, documented over 300 cases between 1844 and 1847. His journals, preserved in the Munich Medical Archives, describe phenomena that challenge everything we understand about human biology. Patients whose fingertips could hold iron nails suspended in the air. Women who had to eat with wooden spoons because metal cutlery would adhere permanently to their lips. Girls whose hairpins would slowly migrate across their scalps throughout the day, clustering around specific points on their heads like iron filings around a magnet. The medical establishment of the era struggled to provide explanations. Some physicians theorized about electrical imbalances in the nervous system. Others suggested atmospheric pressure variations or unusual mineral deposits in drinking water. But none of these theories could account for the specificity of the phenomenon. Why only certain people, why predominantly young women, and why the condition seemed to activate and deactivate according to patterns that had nothing to do with known medical conditions. What made the situation even more perplexing was the geographic distribution of cases. The affected regions didn't follow the boundaries of nations or even logical environmental zones. Instead, they formed a peculiar pattern across the European continent, connecting areas that shared no obvious relationship except for one unsettling detail. They all lay along routes that, when mapped, created geometric shapes that seemed almost deliberately planned. A triangle connecting outbreaks in northern France, western Germany, and the Scottish Highlands. A perfect circle encompassing affected areas in Austria, northern Italy, and eastern Switzerland. Lines of magnetic cases stretching across seemingly random territories, but when viewed from above, revealing a coordination that suggested purpose rather than coincidence. In the archives of the Royal Society of London, buried beneath layers of more conventional medical documentation, lies a report filed by Dr. Margaret Whitmore, one of the few female physicians of the era. Her observations, largely ignored by her male colleagues, provide some of the most detailed accounts of the magnetic epidemic's true scope and character. Dr. Whitmore noted that the condition wasn't random or chaotic. The affected women could often control their magnetic properties to some degree, concentrating the effect in specific parts of their bodies or temporarily suppressing it altogether. She documented cases where patients could make pocket watches stick to their foreheads, cause compass needles to spin wildly in their presence, or attract streams of metal filings from across a room simply by focusing their attention. This wasn't mere attraction. This was manipulation. These women weren't victims of a medical condition. They were exhibiting abilities that resembled a technology that wouldn't be formally understood for decades. The social response to the epidemic reveals as much about Victorian sensibilities as it does about the phenomenon itself. Initially, the magnetic women were treated as medical curiosities, studied by physicians and displayed at traveling exhibitions. But as the numbers grew and the implications became clear, the reaction shifted from fascination to fear. Religious authorities declared the condition demonic. Social reformers blamed it on the moral corruption of industrial society. Government officials began classifying information about the outbreaks, restricting press coverage, and limiting scientific investigation. What had begun as a medical mystery was rapidly becoming a security concern. The fear wasn't entirely irrational. Magnetic humans posed practical problems that authorities weren't equipped to handle. How do you employ someone who can't touch metal tools? How do you provide medical care to patients whose condition makes most instruments unusable? How do you maintain social order when a significant portion of the young female population has developed abilities that seem to violate the laws of physics? But the deeper concern was philosophical. If human beings could spontaneously develop magnetic properties, what other impossible abilities might be lurking dormant within our species? What did it mean for religious doctrine if people could manifest powers that seemed supernatural? What did it mean for scientific understanding if the human body could exhibit behaviors that couldn't be explained by known biological processes? The answers to these questions never came because in 1861 the epidemic simply stopped. Not gradually, not through medical intervention or environmental changes, but abruptly. Women who had been living with magnetic properties for years found their abilities fading over the course of a few weeks. New cases stopped appearing entirely. Within 6 months, the phenomenon had vanished as mysteriously as it had begun. But documents survive. Personal letters between physicians, government correspondence marked as classified, and private journals kept by the affected women themselves. These sources paint a picture of the epidemic's final phase that's more disturbing than its beginning, a systematic effort to erase all evidence that the phenomenon had ever occurred. Dr. Zimmerman's final journal entry, dated December 15, 1861, contains a passage that hints at the scope of this concealment effort. The authorities have requested that all case files be surrendered for archival consolidation. They assure us that the documentation will be preserved for future scientific study, but I have my doubts. There is an urgency to their requests that suggests something other than academic interest. I have retained copies of my most significant observations, hidden where they are unlikely to be found. Similar entries appear in medical journals across Europe during the winter of 1861 to 62. Physicians writing about visits from government officials, requests for medical records, and subtle pressure to discontinue research into magnetic phenomena. The coordination of these efforts across multiple countries suggests a level of organization that exceeded the typical bureaucratic cooperation of the era. The women themselves provide the most haunting testimony about the epidemic's end. In a letter preserved by the Thornfield family descendants, Mary Thornfield, the Manchester factory girl who had experienced one of the first documented cases, describes the final days of her magnetic abilities. The pulling sensation has been growing weaker each day, as if something that was calling to the metal in my blood has begun to withdraw its voice. But it's not just the ability that's fading, that's the memory of how it felt to have it. Each morning I wake up less certain that it ever happened at all. This detail, the loss of memory accompanying the loss of ability, appears in multiple accounts from the period. The women didn't just stop being magnetic. They began to forget what it had felt like to be magnetic, as if the phenomenon was deliberately erasing itself from their consciousness as well as their bodies. The geographic pattern of the epidemic's disappearance mirrors its original spread, coordinated, systematic, and apparently controlled from some external source. The abilities didn't fade randomly. They disappeared in a specific sequence, following the same geometric patterns that had characterized their initial appearance. Modern attempts to study the magnetic epidemic face a curious obstacle. The documentation is incomplete in very specific ways. Medical records from the affected regions during the 1840 to 1860 period show significant gaps precisely during the months when magnetic cases were most prevalent. Even physical evidence has proven elusive. Objects that should have been magnetized through prolonged contact with affected individuals show no residual magnetic properties when tested today. It's as if the phenomenon was designed to leave no lasting trace, no permanent evidence that could be studied by future scientists and researchers. This level of coordination suggests something far more sophisticated than a natural medical phenomenon. The geometric distribution of cases, the demographic specificity, the simultaneous activation and deactivation across vast geographic areas, these patterns point to external control, to some force or agency capable of manipulating human biology. But what kind of technology could produce such effects across such vast distances? What organization had the reach and resources to coordinate activities across multiple European nations? And what purpose would be served by temporarily granting magnetic abilities to thousands of young women and then systematically removing all evidence of the experiment? The timing of the epidemic provides one potential clue. The 1840 to 1860 period coincided with the early phases of the Industrial Revolution, a time when European society was undergoing rapid technological transformation. Steam power, electricity, and mechanized manufacturing were reshaping civilization at an unprecedented pace. What if the magnetic epidemic wasn't a random medical anomaly, but a test? An experiment designed to gauge how human populations would respond to the introduction of impossible abilities? The demographic targeting supports this interpretation. Young women of childbearing age would be ideal test subjects for any experiment designed to study hereditary transmission of enhanced abilities. If this interpretation is correct, then the magnetic epidemic represents something unprecedented. Evidence of a large-scale experiment conducted on human populations by forces with technologies that exceeded anything available to 19th century science. The implications are staggering. If someone or something had the ability to temporarily alter human biology on such a massive scale in 1840, what other experiments might have been conducted? What other impossible phenomena might have been dismissed as medical curiosities or natural anomalies when they were actually technological demonstrations? The women who experienced magnetic abilities during the epidemic often reported other sensations that were undocumented in official medical records. Dreams of vast mechanical structures, visions of geometric patterns that seemed to extend beyond the visible world, and a persistent feeling of being observed or monitored even when alone. These subjective experiences were dismissed by physicians as psychological side effects. But when viewed in the context of a controlled experiment, they become indicators of a monitoring system, evidence that the subjects were being studied for their overall response to biological alteration. The sudden cessation of the epidemic in 1861 corresponds with other significant events in European history. The unification movements in Germany and Italy, the American Civil War, and the beginning of major railroad construction projects across the continent. It's just possible that whatever organization was conducting the magnetic experiment had achieved its objectives and was moving on to other activities that required different applications of their advanced technologies. But perhaps the most disturbing implication of the magnetic epidemic is what it suggests about the relationship between human populations and forces that operate beyond our awareness or understanding of reality. If our human biology can be altered without our knowledge or consent, if impossible abilities can be temporarily activated and then removed while erasing our memory of the experience, then how do we know what other modifications might have been made to our species throughout history? The magnetic women of 1840 to 1860 weren't the subjects of a natural phenomenon. They were participants in an experiment conducted by an intelligence that possessed technologies we were only beginning to imagine. An experiment that was carried out with such precision and planning that it left almost no trace of its occurrence. Almost no trace, but not quite none. The documents survive. The patterns are visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. The geometric distribution of cases, the demographic targeting, the coordinated activation and deactivation, the systematic concealment of evidence, all point to a level of organization and technological capability that shouldn't have existed in the 19th century, which raises the final, most unsettling question. If such capabilities existed then, what experiments might be taking place now? What impossible phenomena occurring in our current era might actually be carefully controlled tests conducted by forces we don't recognize? What aspects of our modern experience might be manipulated by technologies disguised as natural occurrences? The magnetic women of Europe weren't victims of a medical anomaly. They were subjects in a test that revealed the existence of powers that prefer to remain hidden. Powers that can alter human biology, coordinate activities across continents, and erase evidence of their operations so thoroughly that the experiments become indistinguishable from myths. The question isn't whether such powers exist. The evidence of the magnetic epidemic proves they do. The question is what they're testing next, and whether I'll be any more aware of our participation than the women who discovered metal clinging to their fingertips in the flickering gaslight of a Manchester factory floor. The physical artifacts that remain tell their own story of the impossible. In private family collections across Europe, twisted hairpins and bent needles bear witness to the magnetic epidemic's reality. Under examination, these objects reveal structural changes that modern science struggles to explain. Crystalline alterations suggesting exposure to electromagnetic fields that shouldn't have existed in the 19th century. Photography had become increasingly common during the epidemic years, and several rare daguerreotypes capture the phenomena in action. These images show streams of iron filings creating geometric patterns around subjects, metal objects suspended at impossible angles, and women whose hairpins appear to be writing mathematical symbols in the air around their heads. The symbols are particularly intriguing. When analyzed by modern experts, they reveal equations relating to electromagnetic field theory that weren't formally discovered until decades later. It's as if the magnetic abilities came with built-in knowledge, as if the women were being used as organic computing devices solving problems beyond their conscious understanding. The epidemic's end in 1861 coincided with another phenomenon, aurora-like lights appearing across European skies far south of their normal zone. These atmospheric displays seemed to respond to human movement and exhibited patterns that suggested artificial rather than natural origins. The connection wasn't coincidence. It was extraction, a systematic withdrawal of whatever had been temporarily installed in human subjects. The women who experienced this process reported dreams of vast geometric structures and sensations of being connected to something enormous. These weren't hallucinations but glimpses of the experiment's true scope, a continental-scale project testing the feasibility of large-scale population modification. The success established parameters that continue influencing human development across the globe today. The technologies demonstrated between 1840 and 1860 proved that human biology could be altered remotely, consciousness could be programmed with impossible knowledge, and large-scale experiments could be conducted while maintaining the illusion of natural phenomena. Because somewhere, in some secret archive we're not supposed to access, the results of the magnetic experiment are being analyzed. The data is being processed. The next test is being planned. And we might already be a part of it now,